Welcome to this Wisel Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series, we'll give you an overview of how to create and publish your first Power BI report. We'll begin by looking at how you get data into a blank report from a variety of different sources, including Excel, text files, and Word documents. We'll look at how you can use the Power Query Editor to transform your data and clean it up before it's imported. We'll then look at how you can create a data model, including how you can create relationships between various different tables that you've imported, and do things like apply default formatting and default aggregation. We'll move on then and look at how you work with basic visualizations, such as tables, charts, and gauges, and we'll look at a few of the key formatting properties for visualizations. We'll also look at how you can edit interactions between visuals and how you can filter reports using slicers. Towards the end of the video, we'll look at some basic map visuals and how you can filter and format those. And then to finish, we'll look at how you can upload a report to the Power BI service and then publish that report so that it can be accessed by anyone in the world. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail in any particular topic here. The idea is to give you an overview of the basic workflow for getting from a blank report to a finished published version. So hopefully you'll feel like you've reached that stage by the end of the video, if you make it that far. So there's quite a lot to do. We better get started. Before we begin, I'm going to assume that you've already installed the Power BI desktop application. If you haven't done that yet, you might find it useful to refer back to the first part of this series, which explains exactly how to do it. I'm currently running the May 2019 update for Power BI Desktop, and I mention this mainly in case you're watching the video in the future and you have a later update installed. You might see some minor differences on your screen compared to what's shown in the video. Things move quite quickly in the world of Power BI. We're currently receiving monthly updates to the software, which makes it quite difficult to create a future-proof version of this video. Anyway, hopefully things are still similar enough that you'll be able to follow along. When you do have the software installed, you can simply run the application to create a brand new blank report. I've done that already and been presented with my basic splash screen, giving me some basic options for performing common tasks. You might also see that I'm signed in already with my basic free Power BI account. It doesn't really matter whether you're signed in at this point or not, but it does help to avoid seeing those relentless prompts to sign in if we've already done it. The first step in creating almost any report in Power BI is to choose to get some data. Most of the data for our first simple report is going to come from a single Excel workbook. If I navigate briefly back to the desktop, you can see I have a workbook in there called movies.xlsx. There's also a couple of supporting files, a certificate list text file and a genre list Word document. I'll pop a link in the video description that you can use to download these files, but just for now I'll double click to open up the Movies workbook so you can see what we're about to import. If you've watched any of our other video series, for instance on Report Builder or SQL, you'll be fairly familiar with this set of data by now. It's our standard list of about 1,200 films with various categories of information about each movie. For now, I'm just going to close down the workbook, and then we'll choose to import all the data from that single worksheet into our Power BI data model. I can choose to get data in a variety of places. You may notice on my splash screen I have a quick link to get data. If I wasn't displaying my splash screen or I'd already closed it down, as I will do now, I can also use the Home tab in the Power BI desktop ribbon. If I click the bottom half of the Get Data button, I'll be presented with a short list of common connector types, and Excel sits right there at the top. If I couldn't see the connector type that I wanted, I can click the More option at the bottom, and then I'll see a dialog box with a fairly impressively long list of connection types I could use. This list is growing all the time. Every update seems to add more. Anyway, what we want to do in this case is choose Excel, so I can either select that and click Connect or just double click the Excel connector type. The exact dialog box you see next will depend on the connection type you've chosen. For an Excel connection, all I need to do is point to the file containing the data. So I've already browsed to my desktop. All I need to do now is double click on the Movies workbook to start to import it. When the next dialog box appears, I'll be presented with a list of items that belong to this Excel workbook. Excel might show you a variety of different things. I can see both worksheet names and named ranges in this list. If you're not sure what a named range is, don't worry too much. If you're not sure what data is contained in any of these items, you can simply click on it to see a small preview of the data on the right-hand side. As it turns out, both the movie range named range and the sheet 1 worksheet contain exactly the same set of data. So in this case, it doesn't actually matter which one you pick. To import the data, you need to check the box next to the item you want to import, and you can select multiple items, so if you have many worksheets, you can import them all in one step. And then you can choose to either load the data directly into your data model, or you can choose to edit the query that's used to extract this data in the first place. We can always edit the query later on, so for now, all I'm going to do is click the load button, and eventually what we'll see is a table of data gets imported into our Power BI report. It's not a very impressive end result, but eventually what you will see when it's finally finished is your new table appears in the fields list on the right hand side of the screen with all of the column headings from that worksheet. Now that we've imported the table, we can start to make changes to the data in a variety of interesting ways. The first simple change I'd like to make actually is to modify its name, because sheet 1 isn't a very descriptive name. To modify the name, I can simply right click on it in the fields list and then choose to rename it. I could also just choose to double click on the name sheet 1 to rename it. Let's change the name of this so that it's called movie table. And then when I press enter, that table will then be renamed. Now, as well as being able to see a simple list of fields in this part of the screen on the right hand side, there are some other views of your data you can make use of as well. If you look in the list on the left hand side of the screen, there are 3 different views of your Power BI report. There's the report view, which is the one you start in, and this is primarily used to add in all the fancy visuals and make your data look attractive. There's also a data view, which if I click on that on the left hand side, shows me pretty much like an Excel worksheet view of the data. It's not quite exactly the same. You might notice that the sorting is slightly different. We can make a few changes to the data here, and we'll come back and do that shortly. The third and final view you can see is called the model view. If I click on that, it's not particularly useful at this stage. The model view is useful when you have multiple tables in your model and you want to indicate how those tables are related. And again, we'll come back to that a little later on when we've actually got some extra tables imported. For now, I'm just going to switch back to the report view. The 3 views of a report that we've just seen allow you to modify data after it's been loaded into the data model. What I'd like to do, however, is modify the data before it's loaded into the report. To do that, I can use the Query Editor tool, and I can launch that in a variety of ways. I can use the top half of the Edit Queries button on the Home tab of the ribbon, or I can click on the drop-down list and choose Edit Queries. And I can even just right-click on the name of a table in the Fields list and choose Edit Query from there. That's the option I'll pick in this case, and you should see now that I have a separate application running. I've got 2 separate tasks. This one is called the Power Query Editor. If you're already familiar with the Power Query add-in in Excel, you'll be right at home in this application because it's exactly the same tool. Although it looks superficially similar to the data view you've just seen in the Power BI report, the types of operations you can perform in this application are very different. Power Query is an example of an ETL, or an Extract Transform Load tool. And its basic job is to extract data from some kind of source, in this case an Excel workbook, transform or mold that data in some way so we can put it into a form that we can make the best use of in our final report, and then to load that data into some kind of destination, which in our case will be our Power BI data model. There are many things we can do in this application. I'm certainly not intending to show you everything, there simply won't be enough time. But I'd like to show you a few of the key basic things you can do with the Power Query Editor. Before we start making our own changes to the data, it's worthwhile understanding a little about what Power Query has done for us already to get the data to its current state. Power Query modifies data by applying a sequence of query steps, and you can see the sequence of steps that it's applied in the Applied Steps list on the right-hand side of the screen. One of the nice things about this list is that I can click back on any previous stage to see what the data was like at that point. If I go all the way back to the source step, I'm taken back to show me the two different items I could have imported in the wizard, the worksheet name sheet 1 or the named range movie range. If I click on navigation, it shows me the raw data that's imported. You'll notice that the first row of data shows the column headings, whereas the column headings currently are just set to generic things like column 1, column 2. If I click on the third step, promoted headers, you'll see that the first row of data now becomes the column headers for each column. I can then click on the changed type option or step. That won't show much difference to the data itself, but you might notice a subtle difference to the symbols that appear next to the column names when I select changed type. The other interesting thing you can see when you select a step in the list is the code required to perform that step in the formula bar at the top of the window. The language used here is known as Power Query M Formula Language, or just M for short. Sometimes it's known as Mashup Query Language as well. The good news is you don't need to learn how to write much of this language at all. We've already written some of it simply by following the wizard to import our Excel workbook. And if you click through the steps, you'll see the individual lines of code written out for you. If you want to see the entire procedure that's been written for us so far, you can use the Home tab of the ribbon and click on the Advanced Editor tool, and that will show you the entire procedure that's been used to import this data up to this point. I'm not intending to teach you anything about writing M at this point. What I'm going to do is use some of the simple handy tools on the ribbon and in the right click menus to add some extra transforms. So at this point I'm just going to cancel this dialog box and get back to our Power Query editor. The first step we'll apply manually will involve deleting some columns that we don't need in the final report. So we'll get rid of the ID column and the director column as we won't need them. Before you start applying your own steps, it's worthwhile selecting the last step in the current list, because the new one that you insert will be added immediately after the one you have selected. When query steps are applied, they're always applied in the sequence they're shown here, so inserting a step halfway through can have drastic consequences. So let's make sure we've got the changed type step selected, and then to remove the ID column, it's very simple. I can just right click at the top and choose to remove. I can then do exactly the same thing for the director column. I can right click at the top and choose remove, and you'll see there that I've got a new step in the list called removed columns. If I wanted to undo that, what I'd have to do is delete that step. I can always go back and check what the data was like at a previous stage, remember? If I click on changed type, my director and ID columns appear to reappear, but when the full sequence of steps is applied, at the end those columns will have been removed. To delete that step, I can simply click the cross and then the columns will reappear, and this time at the end of the sequence of steps they will still be part of the data set. This time I'm going to select both columns at the same time. There's no redo button, sadly, so what I can do is I can click on the ID column header, then hold down Control and click on the director column header, then right click on any of the two I've selected and choose remove columns to remove them both at the same time. As well as removing columns that we don't need, we can also filter out unnecessary rows. For this particular example, I only want to see films which have been nominated for at least one Oscar. So if I scroll across to the right to find the Oscar nominations column, I can then click on the drop-down list at the top, choose number filters, and here I'll choose greater than or equal to. If I then type in the value I'm interested in, so I'll go for any rows with a value of greater than or equal to 1, I can then click OK, and I'll end up with fewer rows in the data set to be imported into my data model. Another common but simple change you can make to your data is to alter the type of the column. You can see the current type of a column indicated by the symbol that appears to the left of its name. If I click on the 1, 2, 3 symbol next to Oscar nominations, you can see that indicates that it's a whole number. I could modify that to a decimal number or any other type that I like. Now, Power Query does a reasonably good job at guessing what the data type of a column is with the changed type step that we saw earlier on. It doesn't always get it absolutely correct though. If I scroll along to the title column, for example, I can see here the symbol is ABC123, whereas for other columns containing text, such as the country, it just says ABC. So the ABC123 indicates that it's not entirely sure what data type is in there. It could be a mix of types. To find out what's causing this, I can sort the column temporarily. If I click on the drop-down list next to title and choose to sort ascending, I'll find that there's a single film at the top of the list whose title consists of just numeric values. So Power Query thinks that's a mix of text and numbers. Now, although that technically is a number, we should really treat it as text for the purposes of our report. So what we can do is modify the data type of this column to say that that's definitely just text. And I'll see that this value gets left aligned in the cell, indicating it is now treated as text. Sorting rows isn't really that important in Power Query. Sorting can be done at the report level in a variety of different ways. So what I'd like to do is delete the sorted rows step. Now, ordinarily, again, this is quite dangerous. Deleting a step in the middle can be just as dangerous as inserting a step somewhere in the middle of the sequence. But in this case, I'll be safe deleting the sorted rows step. I'm asked to confirm that I want to do that because it might break the rest of my query. But here, if I click delete, I can safely get away with that step being deleted and everything else still works. Now, there are many other ways you could modify the existing data in your query. As I say, we don't have enough time to show you absolutely everything you can do here, but you can get a good clue about what you can do to a particular column by, for example, right-clicking on its column header and looking at the options in the right-click menu, or you can head onto the Transform tab in the ribbon and see what options are available in there. I would like to show you how you can add new columns to your dataset as well. Let's add a quick calculated column that calculates a basic profit or loss by subtracting the budget dollars column from the box office dollars. To do that, I can head on to the Add Column tab, and then I can click the Custom Column button. This will then launch a basic query editor or expression editor. I can give my new column a simple name. Let's call this one Profit or Loss. I can then either write my formula into this text box, or I can just, in this case, select fields from my fields list on the right-hand side. I can double-click box office dollars to insert that, then type in a minus symbol, and then double-click on budget dollars. If I get a little green tick at the bottom, the query is happy, so I can click OK, and then I add in my brand new column to the right-hand side of the existing table. One interesting feature of Power Query, and something which really indicates the sequential nature of these query steps, is that now that I've added my profit or loss column, if I didn't need to show the budget or box office values in my report anywhere, I can happily delete those two columns without affecting the result of profit or loss. If I select budget and box office, I can right click, and then I can choose to delete or remove those columns. And you can still see there that profit or loss is still showing the result, simply because of the sequence in which things have happened. So another great way to save space in your data model, if you don't need columns after you've used them to perform calculations, get rid of them. There's absolutely no reason to keep them. For the final change we'll make to the data in the query editor, we'll apply a new custom column which calculates whether a film is a winner or a loser based on the value of the Oscar wins column. If the Oscar wins is 0, then it's a loser, otherwise it's a winner. To do that, I can either create a custom column and write out a formula from scratch, or I can use a simple little conditional column dialog box. So from the Add Column tab in the ribbon, I can click Conditional Column and then fill in the details in this dialog. Let's call the new column Success, and then I can simply build up a sequence of conditions saying if column name Oscar wins equals, and then I can type in a value of 0. Then I can type in the result, which will be loser. I can then choose to add more rules if I want to build up a sequence of rules. Alternatively, I can just jump straight to the else box and say what to happen if that first condition has not been met. So if the Oscar wins is not equal to 0, then the film must be a winner. At that point, I can click OK, and my new success column has been created as well. If you decide that you need to make changes to those conditions you've applied, you can always get back to the same dialog box by clicking the little gear or cog icon next to the step in the steps list. You'll see that same icon appears next to various steps, and clicking it will open up the dialog box used to apply that step. So for the conditional column, I can click the cog and I get the same dialog box back. I'm not going to make any changes here, I'll just click cancel just to complete that. The final change I'm going to make in this particular query is to modify the profit or loss column. You might notice here that the profit or loss data type is set to ABC123, indicating there's a mix of different data types. It looks as though they're all numbers, but if I performed a quick sort, and I'll go in ascending order, I'll find that there are several missing values, several nulls in the list. So these were generated because some of the budget and box office values were null in the first place. What I'd like to do is replace any nulls with a 0, so that I can treat all of these values as numbers. Let's just remove the sorted rows transform to begin with, and then what I can do is replace values in the profit or loss column. If I right click at the top of it, I can then choose to replace values. In the dialog box that appears, I can look for the value null, and then replace that with a 0 instead. At that point I can click OK. And then finally I can change the data type of this so it's all treated as numbers. So I can click on the little symbol at the top of the column and then choose whole number. At that point I can then save and apply my changes back to the data model. So to do that I can head back to the Home tab, find the Close and Apply button, and then simply click the top half of that button to save all those changes and apply them back to the Power BI report. We should see when the changes have been applied, we end up with a new list of fields. So the old ones have been removed and the new ones now exist. So there we go, there's the basics of using the query editor to transform your data. So we've seen a few basic changes we can make to our data before it's loaded into the report. What about things we can do to it afterwards? The key to this is using the Modelling tab in the ribbon. If I select that tab, I'll find that many of the options are greyed out, and that's because I haven't selected a column whose properties I want to change yet. So I can select a column, let's say for example I wanted to apply a currency format to the profit or loss column. That's not something I can do in the Power Query Editor, or at least not easily, but if I select the profit or loss column in the fields list, I'll find some fairly familiar looking controls that allow me to modify that basic number format. Now, although I can do this while I'm looking at the report view, it's not easy to see the effect of my changes. What you might prefer to do is head into the data view, where you can see the actual column itself, and you can select the column by clicking the column header. And then when you select an option from the formatting section of the Modelling tab in the ribbon, so here I'll choose the English United States dollar, I'll see those changes take place and I can see what effect they've had. I can use the same approach to format the release date column. If I highlight that column first, then I can use the format option to apply a slightly more compact date format. Rather than seeing the complete month name, I'll just see the day, month, year in this fairly standard format. So if I can click on that, I'll see that all my dates get updated there as well. And that's how they'll now appear if I add them to any visuals in the report view. Another useful thing I can do here is change the default aggregate function that's applied to certain columns. So for example, if I pick the runtime minutes column, when I add this to some visuals in the report view, for example into a chart, Power BI will attempt to sum the runtime minutes, and I can see that from the default summarization option. If I'd prefer to have the average runtime minutes in most cases, I can set that as the default by clicking on the drop-down list and choosing average. Now, that doesn't mean I can't change it later on, but if I was going to use average runtime minutes more often than some, it would make sense to change it here so that I have less work to do when I start applying that column to visuals later. I can also choose to apply a data category to certain columns, and this is particularly useful for geographic data. If I select the country column, for example, if I wanted to tell Power BI that this column indicated a geographic country name, I could set its data category using this option in the Modelling tab. So I can find the country/region option in there and select that. And that will help Power BI to understand what values are contained in that column when I come to adding visuals such as maps later on. It's also possible to add new calculated columns in the Modelling tab. If you can see here in the Calculations section, I can add a new column. The language used to create calculated columns in Power BI is referred to as DAX, or Data Analysis Expressions. Now, the language is fundamentally different to the M language we've been using in the query editor, but there is quite a lot of crossover in terms of the end results. I could, for example, have created a DAX expression to calculate the profit or loss, or the success of films based on the Oscar wins using an if function. For those two examples, I think it made sense to perform them in the query editor, particularly as for profit or loss, we wanted to remove the original budget and box office dollar columns. We couldn't take that approach with a DAX expression, it would rely on us having those columns remaining in the dataset. Just to demonstrate the basics of creating a DAX expression, let's replicate the success column with an if function. If I click the new column button, I then get a new blank column added, and then the formula bar is activated, showing me the name of my new column with an interesting title of column. Let's just expand that formula bar by clicking the drop down arrow here. Then I can hold the control key and roll the mouse wheel forwards to zoom in so you can see what we're doing. First of all, I'm going to rename my column because column's a pretty terrible name. Actually, Success 2 isn't that much of a better name, but I can't think of anything more inventive than that. We'll delete this column shortly, so don't worry too much about giving it a better name than that. So Success 2 equals, then if you're familiar with Excel in any way, shape or form, the DAX language will make you feel right at home. There's quite a lot of sort of common functions. For example, the if function. If I begin typing in the word if, I'll see the if function appears in the list. I get a nice handy tooltip explaining what the if function does. I can hit the tab key when the if function is highlighted in the list. And then I can write my logical test. So I want to check if the Oscar wins column is equal to 0. If I simply begin typing in the name of the Oscar wins column, I should find that eventually the list shows me a way to select that. So with Oscar wins typed in, I can just press the tab key when that item is highlighted to have the rest of it typed in. If I then type in equals 0, followed by a comma, and then the result, if true, will be a loser. So I'll write that in a set of double quotes. And then another comma, and the result if false, the else part, will be winner. And again, I'll write that in its own set of double quotes. If I then close the parentheses and then either press enter to complete the formula or click the tick to commit the formula. Once I've done that, if I then collapse this window, you should see that my new Success 2 column has been created. So clearly there's some amount of crossover in the output you can generate using either M in the query editor or DAX in the Power BI desktop front end. In this particular case, you'd almost certainly choose to add the column using M in the query editor. It makes sense to calculate the value before it's loaded into the data model. You will of course find yourself using DAX at some point. DAX lends itself more to calculations which operate across different tables in the same data model, or even more importantly when you're creating measures, which we might get a chance to have a brief look at in this video. Measures are sophisticated calculations that really allow you to analyse the data that belongs to your model, and you'll spend an awful lot of time doing that later on in this series. For now, let's just choose to delete the Success 2 column as we don't need to duplicate that value. So let's right click at the top of the column and then we can choose to delete it by selecting delete and then confirm that we want to do that, and then the column will disappear along with the expression that we wrote. The next thing I'd like to do is load a second table into our data model that allows us to look up the certificate ID from the certificate ID column and translate that into a descriptive piece of text which shows us what certificate has been assigned to the film. We'll do that by importing a simple text file called certificate list. If I quickly double click to open that, it's a very basic tab delimited text file with column headers, and we can see that each number in the certificate ID column corresponds to a particular film certificate. I'll close down that text file and then head back to the Power BI desktop application. And although it doesn't really matter which view you happen to be in when you import this data, it's a little easier to illustrate what I'm trying to demonstrate here if we look at the model view first of all. If you've ever worked with database diagrams in, for example, Microsoft Access or in SQL Server Management Studio, this is essentially what the model view is. When we import the certificate table, we'll be able to create a relationship between the certificate ID column in the movie table with the certificate ID column in the certificate list. Let's head back to the Home tab then and choose to get data. This time we're going to go for a text/CSV file. So if we choose that, we then need to pick the text file we're importing. I can just double click certificate list. In the next stage in the wizard, I'll get a brief preview of the data I'm about to import. Again, I could choose to edit the data by opening up the query editor. For now, I'm just going to choose to load it directly into the data model. Now, quite cleverly, what Power BI will try to do is recognize column names in the two tables that are currently imported. So it recognizes that certificate ID is in the movie table and in the certificate list. It draws a relationship between the two tables, and I appreciate that it doesn't really look as though it's pointing to the correct fields. It looks kind of though it's trying to join profit or loss to, it's not really sure in this case. But the line isn't designed to point to the correct columns. If you position the mouse cursor over the line, you'll see that the columns that are joined together are actually highlighted in the list in bright yellow there. So you can see that it's highlighted the correct and joined the correct columns. Power BI does a reasonably good job of detecting which columns should be joined together. The case doesn't have to be the same. I could even leave spaces between certificate and ID or use underscores, and Power BI will pick up on all that and recognise that those two columns should be joined. If they were spelt differently or they were given completely different names, however, that relationship wouldn't be brought in automatically. If I right-click on the relationship line, I can choose to delete it, and if I choose that I want to confirm to do that, this is what the table would look like if it was brought in without any kind of common field. It's fine because you can create these relationships manually just by clicking and dragging between two columns. So if I click and drag between certificate ID onto certificate ID, and then when the relationship has been created, hover the mouse over the line to make sure I've dropped my field in the correct place. It looks as though I have in this case. So there you go, you can create relationships manually at any point. The symbols that you see at the end of the relationship lines indicate what type of relationship we're looking at. So the one symbol at the certificate list end indicates that each certificate ID in that table exists once and once only. The star symbol, the asterisk on the end of the movie table, indicate that the certificate ID in that table can appear many times. So for example, there are many films with a U certificate and many films with a PG certificate. So we have effectively a one-to-many relationship, which is a fairly familiar feature if you've had any kind of experience with designing relational databases. The final table we'll import into our data model will come from a Word document. If I just quickly navigate back to my desktop and double click on my genre list Word document, you'll see it contains a simple table with a similar setup to the certificate list. I have a column containing the ID number and a second column containing the descriptive text. Now, unfortunately, there isn't currently a connector for Word in Power BI, but fortunately we can get around that essentially by copying and pasting the Word table directly into the Power BI data model. So I'm going to select the Word table by clicking the little symbol in the top left-hand corner. Then I can copy it by pressing Ctrl and C or clicking the copy tool. And then I can head back to Power BI Desktop. What I want to do first of all is choose to enter data. So I can do that by clicking that button on the Home tab of the ribbon. The next dialog box allows me to essentially type in a manual table. I don't want to type in all the genres that I've just copied. So if I click into that section of the dialog and press Ctrl and V to paste, I get the entire table pasted in one go. It's recognized that the first column contains column headers. It makes a distinction between the data types in most of the rows in the very first row. So genre ID is text. The remaining columns are numeric values. I can give the table a sensible name. Let's call this one genre list. And then again, I can either load or edit it. In this case, I'll choose to load it. Once again, because the column headers are matching in the movie table and the genre list table, I've got the same genre ID field. The relationship is created for us automatically. Remember that you can always visit the query editor if you want to make any changes to the new data you've imported. If we click Edit Queries and choose Edit Queries, the query editor loads this time, but with multiple queries available in the list on the left-hand side. So if I click Certificate List, I can see the list of steps that have been applied. It looks like it's done a pretty good job at guessing the data types, numeric data for certificate ID and text data for certificate. If I go to the genre list, it's done a similar job. Again, not many steps applied in this case, but again, distinguishing between numeric data and text. The query editor is a place you can modify the genre list. If you've entered data, you can go to the source step and click the cog icon here, and that will bring back the dialog box that was used to enter the data in the first place. So if I wanted to add in a new genre, I could click into the cell at the bottom and type in a new ID number and then a new genre name. In this case, I'm just going to click cancel to abandon that. I'm going to, because I've added a new row, by clicking on that, I am sure that I do want to exit and lose my changes. That's fine. And then if I just make sure that I've closed and applied to the query editor to get back to the data model. The final useful thing we're going to do in our data model at this point is affect the visibility of some of the columns in it. We've got a lot of ID columns in various tables at this point, and these are required in order to create the relationships. We can't simply exclude them from the import. But if we go to the report view, it's not particularly useful to see the ID columns in the various tables. Fortunately, in the model view, I can choose to hide those columns. If I go to the movie table first and select certificate ID, I can simply change its hidden property or its is hidden property in the properties panel on the right hand side. You might notice there's a few other similar options that we've seen in the modeling tab, so I could change the formatting and the data type of the values I've selected or the fields I've selected, but doing it in a separate place in this formatting panel on the right hand side. Now I want to change the visibility of all the ID fields, so rather than just selecting one at a time, let's hold the control key and select all 4 of them. Then I can either click my little is hidden property there, or I can also right click on any of the existing fields or the selected fields and choose hide in report view. You'll see that that changes the is hidden property to on there as well. So although they're still visible in the data model view, if I switch back to the report view now, I get a slightly cleaner field list, making it easier to select the correct thing for my visuals. Okay, so we're through with the fairly tedious but important job of building the data model in the first place. Now we're on to the exciting part of Power BI, adding all the fancy visuals that display your data in interesting and exciting ways. I've returned to the report view first of all, and I can see my visualizations panel in the top right hand corner of my screen. There's a couple of ways you can get started with adding visuals to a page. You can start with the visual first approach, whereby you find the visual type that you want in the visualizations panel. So for example, if I wanted to go with a fairly boring table, I can find that tool in the list and then simply click on that to add one to the report. When that item is still selected, I can then start adding fields to it, either just by ticking a box in the field list. So for example, I can tick the title box, or I can drag a field from here into the table object in the report. So for example, let's say I wanted to drag in my Oscar nominations column, I can drag that straight into the table visual. Alternatively, I can drag a field from the fields list into the somewhat unfortunately named field well. I don't think they've done a very good job at naming the various areas of the Power BI desktop application. So the fields list on the right hand side shows you all the available fields in the model. The field well, just below the visualizations panel, shows you the fields that have been added to the selected visual. So if I wanted to add in the Oscar wins column, I can then just drag that and I can choose where that goes. You'll see that I can position it in different places based on where that horizontal yellow line appears. I'll add Oscar wins below Oscar nominations, and then if I simply change the width of that table, I should see those 3 columns that I've added. Rather than starting with the visual first, you could simply choose to begin adding fields to your report, and Power BI makes a decision about what it thinks is the best type of visual to use to display that data. But it's not that important a choice. You can always modify any visual into any other type at any point you like. So to add a new visual, make sure that you don't have an existing one selected. If I just click into a blank part of the page, this time I'd like to display a chart which shows, let's say, something like the average Oscar wins and average Oscar nominations for each genre in the genre table. If I simply start by ticking the genre column, I'll find that Power BI decides that should be a table, basically because it's text data. I could then add in the Oscar nominations and Oscar wins columns, so I can tick those boxes from the movie table list. By default, they will be shown as a sum of Oscar nominations and a sum of Oscar wins. And I know that because on the modelling tab, if I selected either Oscar nominations or Oscar wins, the default summarization is sum. If I wanted to modify that, I can do that either in the modelling tab, so it's a permanent change, or I can just modify the aggregate that's applied to this particular visual. So for Oscar nominations, I can click on the drop-down arrow here and simply choose average instead. I'll do the same thing for Oscar wins to change that to an average, and now I've got my data organised. What I really wanted to do, however, was display this visual as a chart rather than as a table, but that's a nice easy thing to do. At any point, as I say, you can change the visual type just by clicking on the visual you want in this visualizations panel. So here I'll go with a clustered column chart. If I click on that with that visual selected, it instantly changes its type. It's quite a fun thing to play around with actually. You can see all the various visual types very quickly just by clicking on the different ones in this list. So you can find the one that you think looks best to display the data you're trying to show. I'll go back with a clustered column chart just for this basic example. The final type of visual I'm going to add in for the moment is called a gauge, and a gauge is designed to show a single data point, a single important value. I'll start by making sure I don't have any existing visuals selected by clicking into a blank part of the page, and then find the gauge option in the visualizations panel. Once I've added one of those, I can simply add the Oscar wins field to it by clicking the Oscar wins field in the fields list. And then in the field well, I can find Oscar wins, click on the drop down arrow and change the sum to an average. Now Power BI makes it fairly simple to rearrange items on a page. What I'd like to do is arrange these items horizontally at the bottom half of the screen. So I'm going to start by moving the gauge first of all. If I hover the mouse over a blank part of it, I can simply click and drag on that to move it around. You'll notice a bunch of red lines appear indicating that I've got my gauge in a particular position, so it snaps to the center point of the page, both vertically and horizontally. And it also snaps to the edges of other visuals on the same page, so I can get them exactly in line with each other fairly easily. I'm going to drop the gauge right in the bottom right hand corner, and then I can resize it using the resizing handles around the border of the gauge. So let's just change the width and height of this so it takes up a little less space. I'll then start moving my chart to sit next door to the gauge, and I don't want it to sit exactly right up to the gauge. I'll just move it a couple of notches along to the left. You'll see that the visuals move in little notches, and that's because they're designed to snap to the grid by default. If I head to the View tab in the ribbon, you'll see there's a little checkbox there that says Snap Objects to Grid. If you'd rather have your objects move more smoothly, you can uncheck that box. I can also choose to show grid lines to help me see where I'm aligning my objects to and be consistent with the sizes. For this particular example, I'm going to remove the grid lines, so I'll just do this by eye, by sight. So then let's drag the table, find a blank part of the table to click and drag on first of all. Drag that down to the bottom left-hand corner. I could change the width of that a little tiny bit, maybe change the column width of the title column as well. So I can just click and drag that a little bit as well. Then let's make the chart a little wider so it's a little easier to see the various columns. And then I can just make the gauge object a little bit taller so it's the same height as my other two objects in that part of the report. There we go. I can sort the values in a visual in a couple of different ways depending on the visual type. For a table, the simplest way to sort is just to click at the top of a column. For example, if I wanted to sort so that the winningest film, if that's even a word, appears at the top of the list, I can click on the Oscar wins column and I'll see the films with the most Oscar wins shoot to the top. I could have also done that using the little extra menu, the more options menu that appears, this little ... the ellipsis button here. If I click on that, I could have chosen to sort by any of the columns in the visual and then chosen to sort in ascending or descending order. I can do the same thing for a chart, but I can't obviously click on a column heading in the chart. What I can do is use the little more options menu. Let's say rather than sorting in descending order of average Oscar nominations, let's sort alphabetically by genre. So if I select genre first of all, and then I can go to the More Options menu again and choose Sort Ascending. For a gauge, there's not an awful lot of opportunity to sort, and as it only has a single option in it, a single value in it, there's nothing to sort by, so I can't select anything useful from that menu. Next, I suppose we should talk about formatting in a report. It's a little tricky to know where to start with formatting because every visual in a report has such a variety of formatting options available to it. So let me just give you a few key points on formatting. First of all, let's start with formatting our table. If I select the table first of all, I then need to switch the view of my field well, which I'm currently looking at, to the format view of this panel. So the icon is designed to look like a little paint roller tool. If I click on that, I'll find that all the field well options get replaced with a section of different categories containing formatting options. If I click through to expand these various categories, I can then see the individual formatting options within them. I can collapse them again and go to a different category and see the options in there. And you can see that there's quite a lot of options available in each section. Microsoft refer to these different sections, by the way, as cards, which is a slightly unfortunate term because they've used the word card to refer to a type of visual as well. So another type of sort of confusing naming convention Microsoft have used here. Anyway, in these little sections you can find the various formatting options. Some of them are fairly easy to understand. They have fairly obvious titles, like, for example, the title card. If I wanted to give my table a title in a similar way to the way the chart and the gauge have a title, I could enable the title first of all by toggling its switch from off to on, and then if I expand that card, I can type in the text I want to appear for the title. So let's say something like a list of films and Oscars, and I'll see the title then appears at the top of the table. When it comes to doing things like formatting text or formatting colours and so on, there are so many different options available in so many different places in the different sections, in the different cards. It can be a little tricky to know exactly where to go. So perhaps the best tip I can give you for formatting things like fonts and colours is to rely on the search box at the top of the formatting panel. You'll actually find the search box in a couple of other places, for example in the fields list. In the search box at the top of the format panel, let's say I want to change the text size. If I start by typing in the word text, I'll see that the formatting panel is then filtered to show all the properties and all the matching categories containing a text property. So that makes it nice and easy to find the particular text size I want to change. Let's say I wanted to change the size of my title or my column titles. I've got a column headers card. I can find the text size and I can bump that up by a couple of points. I could do the same thing then with the totals section. So I find the total and then bump up the text size there as well. Let's change a few colours as well. Just a small word of warning for users in the UK. For some bizarre reason, if you spell colour correctly, as in colour, sadly no options appear, as though there are no colours you can change. So bizarrely you have to misspell colour, you have to spell it incorrectly in order to find anything useful. If you spell colour without the U, then you'll find lots of properties to do with colours. Yes, of course people living across the pond won't find that unnatural in any way whatsoever, but for us limeys that's a little bit unusual. Anyway, now we've found these various formatting properties, let's apply some basic formatting to the title of my table. So I can scroll down to find the title section, and there it is, and I can modify the font colour. Let's make the font colour, let's go for this sort of pale green, sort of aqua colour, and then there we go. So that's been modified there. In fact, let's make that a little bit darker. There we go, that's a little bit too dark. I'll get there eventually. I'll pick a colour I'm happy with eventually. I'll stick with that one. I'll go back to the original. Okay, one other useful thing you can do, if I want to apply that same colour, as I spent so long picking it in the first place, if I want to apply that same colour to the title for both of my other visuals, I can rely on the good old Format Painter tool. If I head back to the Format tab in the ribbon, with my table selected, I can click the Format Painter and then click onto my chart visual, and that will then apply the same formatting properties to the title there as well. I can then do the same thing. I can click the Format Painter tool again and then click on my gauge, and then that will apply the same formatting options to that. So at least it makes life a little easier when you want to replicate the same formats on different visuals. Now, as well as drawing visuals that are related to data in your data model, you can also draw basic static visuals that don't have any data in them at all. If you head to the Home tab in the ribbon, you'll find a little insert section and basic things in here like text boxes, images if you want your corporate logo inserted, and basic shapes as well. What I'm going to do is draw a basic line shape. I'm going to basically draw a little separator between the top and the bottom half of my report. So I'm going to draw a line from the shapes. It's annoyingly inserted as a vertical line first of all, but if I go back to the format panel, I don't have any visualizations or field well for a line. It can't have any fields associated with it. Let me just get rid of the color from the search box as well so I can go back to seeing all of the formatting properties. There's a fairly obviously titled card there called rotation. So what I want to do is either type in the value 90, which would be the easiest way to do it, but the significantly more fun way to do it is to drag the slider to get that to exactly 90. There we go. Nope, not quite. I said it was fun. It ended up becoming frustrating in the end. I should have just typed in the number 90 into that box. I would also like to give that line a title. So I'm going to enable the title by toggling the off to on. And then let's change the title text to, let's call it basic visuals. I will then modify the font color and the background color. So this time I'm going to give the background color a darker color. Let's go for this sort of darkish theme color, and then I'll make the font color white. And then I can change the text size a little as well. Let's bump that up so it's a bit more obvious and stands out. And I'd also like to make the font bold. Now, slightly unusually, there's no bold option, which you may be familiar with from other Microsoft products. What you have to do is choose a font family that is already bold. So currently I'm using this Sego UI. If I click on the drop down list here, I can find the Sego bold option instead. So if I select that, now I'll get a bold font. Okay, let's just resize this visual then. Now I can resize the height, and then I can click and drag downwards to position that just above my other objects. If I sit that just above halfway point on the page, so just below halfway point on the page, there we go, that looks pretty good to me. Then I can change the width of that so it pretty much spans the entire width of the page. Now I've got a nice little basic static separator. Just a final quick note about formatting for the time being. Although you can select colours manually, as I've shown you with great difficulty. For example, if I select my line again and click on the line category and select a line colour, I can pick from one of the preset theme colours or recent colours, and I can choose custom colour as well to pick any colour from the RGB colour palette, 16.7 million different colours in that grid. If I just want to make quick sweeping changes to the appearance of the entire report, what I can do is alter the theme that's applied to the report. I can do that from the Home tab in the ribbon by choosing the Switch Theme option and then picking from one of the other built-in themes. Twilight there has absolutely nothing to do with the Twilight films, by the way, fortunately. So I can pick Sunset, and that affects all the colours, and then I can switch the theme again to Electric and I get slightly different colours, and that also affects the colours I can select in any colour drop down list, so all the theme colours will change. You can import other themes from the marketplace, and you can even create your own theme if you know how to create JSON files, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this particular video for now. Just for now, I'm going to head back to the default theme so we get everything back to that lovely kind of murky sea green colour. Now it's time to start talking about how visuals interact with each other, and you may have already done this by accident. I know I frequently do this whenever I'm designing a report. If you click on an item in one visual on a page, by default it should affect all of the other visuals, either by filtering it or by highlighting some kind of area in it. So for example, if I go to my chart and I highlight the tallest column I can see there, the history genre average Oscar nominations, if I click on that part of the visual, it filters my table to show only films in the history genre, and likewise it filters the gauge to show the average Oscar wins for only history films. You can see that that value matches there with the column if I hover over it. To bring all of the results back again, I can simply click on the same column I clicked on in the first place, and that unfilters everything, and annoyingly leaves my table halfway scrolled down the list, so I can click and drag the scroll bar to get back to the top. If I click on an item in my table, so for example if I click on the Lord of the Rings Return of the King, that doesn't filter the chart, it highlights in the chart the fantasy genre, and it shows a comparison of how many Oscars that Lord of the Rings was nominated for and won compared to the averages for that genre. So I can see that Lord of the Rings clearly outperformed the average for that particular category. The gauge is just filtered to show the average Oscar wins for that one single film, which isn't particularly interesting, it's just the same value as there's only one result returned. Again, to bring everything back, I can just click on the same film name in the title column of the table, and that brings all of the results back for all of the other visuals. Now, this visual interaction feature is kind of a fun thing to play with, and it's kind of handy for your end users as well to be able to investigate the data in your report. But you may feel that sometimes it's not appropriate to use. So for example, while I'm quite happy with being able to click columns in a chart to filter my table and my gauge, I don't really want to be able to select a single item in my table and for that to show just a single value in the gauge and highlight an item in the chart. So what I'd like to do is disable visual interactions for the chart and the gauge when an item in the table is clicked. In order to do that, I'll have the table selected first. Then I can head to the Format tab in the Visual Tools section of the ribbon and then click Edit Interactions. Now what this is going to do is enable a few extra controls on the other unselected visuals on the page. So if you watch this little area in the top right hand corner of these visuals, when I choose Edit Interactions, you'll see I now have further options. So if I position my mouse cursor over the chart and then just zoom in a little bit so you can see a little more clearly what I'm doing, you can see there are three options for the way the table affects the chart. The default option is the middle button that's selected here. It's called Highlight. So you saw that all the other genres just became greyed out and the fantasy genre was highlighted when I selected Lord of the Rings. If I wanted to, I could affect the chart by filtering it. So if I selected Lord of the Rings with filter applied, the chart would only show the fantasy genre. What I really want to do here is disable visual interactions when an item in the table is clicked for the chart. So what I'm going to do here is click the None option. I can then do the exact same thing for my gauge. So if I hover the mouse over the gauge and then zoom in, and I can click the None option for the gauge. There's no highlight option for a gauge, it's either filter or none. So let's set that to none and then zoom back out again. Now you'll find that if I click on an item in the table, nothing happens to either the chart or the gauge. However, if I still click on an item in the chart, both the table and the gauge are affected by that. When I've got the chart selected, I can choose to affect the way the table is affected by the chart and how the gauge is affected by the chart as well. So selecting a different visual changes which tools or which visuals the other symbols appear on. Sorry, I'll get my words out eventually. You'll notice that when you select a gauge, again, because there's only one single value in there, there's nothing really to select. So selecting a gauge doesn't allow me to affect any other visuals anyway. When you've finished changing the way visuals interact with each other, it makes sense to switch off the Edit Interactions tool. So let's do that by clicking the Edit Interactions button again, and then those symbols will disappear. Now, although you can make different visuals interact with each other in terms of filtering, there is a specific type of visual designed for filtering others. And that type of visual is called a slicer. So what we'll do now is if I just select my fantasy genre in the chart to bring back all the items in my table, I'm going to create a new little section at the top of this report that allows me to add a few basic slicers for filtering other objects. So let's copy my line visual first of all. I want to create a little header section for my slicers section. I can press Ctrl and C and then Ctrl and V to copy and paste it. Then I can just drag that new line to the very top of the report page. I'll change the title text in there, so if I find the Format Shape page and then expand the title card and then change the title text from Basic Visuals, I'll change that to, let's call that Slicers. Okay, having done that, I can now start adding some slicer visuals into that section of the report page. I'll start by clicking the slicer tool to insert a new visual, and then I can choose which field I want to assign to it. I'm going to pick the certificate field for this particular example. When I do that, I get a simple list of boxes I can select to filter the other visuals on the page. You should see if I pick the Edit Interactions tool again, that if I have my slicer selected, both the table will be filtered and the chart will be filtered, and the gauge will be filtered as well. So I can pick an item just by clicking on it in the slicer, and that will filter all of the items in the rest of the report. I can hold down the Control key to select multiple items if that's what I want to do, and each time I make a change, it alters the results in the other visuals. To undo all the filters in a slicer, there's a handy little extra tool in the top right hand corner of it. You might just about be able to make out this little eraser tool. If I click on that little tool, it will clear all the current filters and go back to showing all the data in the other visuals. One thing you have to consider when designing slicers is what type of device your user will be using to view the report. If they have a laptop or desktop with a mouse, it's fairly easy for them to click on these tiny little boxes to filter the other visuals. If, however, they're using a touchscreen device, big fat clumsy fingers are going to struggle slightly to click on these tiny little boxes. So what we can do is modify the design of the slicer again to provide slightly bigger buttons for people to point at. With the slicer selected, I can head to the Format panel and then expand the General card and look for the Orientation property, which isn't my immediate guess as to which property I'd use to do this. If we change the orientation from vertical to horizontal, it not only changes the orientation, but it also vastly increases the size of the buttons. So although I can click on them with a mouse, of course, it's even easy to click on those with a finger. I'm just going to rearrange the size of my slicer at this point. I'll change its height slightly and drag it up towards the top of the slicer's section. And then what I'm going to do is change the colour of the selection boxes. So if I collapse the general category here and then expand the selection controls category, beg your pardon, select the items category. I nearly got that one wrong. I should have just searched for colour, basically, shouldn't I? I can change the font colour there to a different font colour. Let's go for a sort of dark greenish, and then let's change the background colour as well to a sort of pale green like that. There we go. If you're thinking about touchscreen devices, then you probably also need to think about how people can select multiple items. Currently, I have to hold down the Control key to select multiple items, otherwise clicking on a different box deselects the first. Now, if I'm working on a touchscreen device, that's no good because I don't have a Control key to hold down. So with the slicer selected, I can head back to the Formatting panel, and in the Selection Controls category this time, I can alter the Multi-Select with Control option. If I toggle that to off rather than on, now when I click on the first option in the slicer, the next time I click on an option it doesn't deselect the first, so I can just carry on clicking to add more items to the selection or click on selected ones to deselect them. Slicers also work quite nicely with numeric and date fields. If I click into a blank part of the report here again and add another slicer, this time I'll choose to add in the runtime minutes field, so I can tick the runtime minutes box. And rather than just getting a basic slicer with buttons, this time, because my field is a continuous numeric range, I get a slider option as well. So I can use this slicer by either typing in a lower and an upper limit, or the more fun way to do it, I can just click and drag on the ends of the slider to affect the results. So again, for a touchscreen, that's a much nicer way to use it than typing in numbers into these little boxes. Let's just change the height of that so I can give myself a little more space, and I'll drag this up a little bit to sit it just below my certificate slicer, and then I can change the width of this one. I want it to sit exactly halfway across the width of the page. So when I get to the point where the vertical red line appears from the top to the bottom of the page, that's exactly halfway. I can do a similar thing with a slicer, adding a date field to it. So let's again click into a blank part of the report and then add a new slicer in and then add the release date field to it. Once again, I get this slider control, But I also get the option to type in dates, or if I click into one of these date boxes, I can even select a date from a calendar control. I can navigate up and down the different months. I can also change the month or change the year by clicking on those items and quickly scrolling up and down to select different items as well. So again, if I just resize this slicer so it's the same height as the one next door to it, much easier for a touchscreen user to just click and drag the sliders to change the range of dates in use. Let's just clear all the formatting from that slicer by clicking the eraser button and get all my data back, and then scroll up to the top of the table so I'm back in the original position. On the subject of dates, it's quite interesting to see what happens to a date field when you add it to a table. So using my existing list of films and Oscars table, I'm going to drag in the release date field and position it just after the title column so I'll easily be able to see it without having to resize everything. If I drop the release date field in there, although what I originally had in my underlying data model was the actual date, what I get when I drop it into a table is a separated year, quarter, month and day. You can see all those separated out in the list here in the field well. Now, sometimes this can be quite handy, and other times it's really irritating. But what I can do here, if I wanted to remove individual items from this, for instance, if I wanted to remove the quarter, I could just click the cross next to that, so I just get the year and month and day. If I simply wanted to revert back to the original field value for release date, what I can do instead is click on the drop-down arrow next to release date, and then choose to view the release date, rather than what we're seeing at the moment, which is called a date hierarchy. So if I choose release date, I'll see that my column now resets to show the actual date value. And if I can just change the width of my columns a little bit so we can see more clearly what's going on, it's been bugging me for a while, there we go. We can now see all the values for that table. If I wanted to modify the column headings in my table without having to modify the underlying field names, fairly simply all I need to do here is double click on the field in the field well. So Oscar nominations is taking up quite a lot of space. I can change that so it's just called Oscar noms. If I do that by double clicking Oscar nominations, I can then alter the title for the table. I'll just call that Oscar noms. I'll put a space in between the word Oscar and noms. And then I can do a similar thing for Oscar wins. I can put a space in between those two words. And then release date likewise. I can double click there and alter that so it says release space date. And that makes the table a little more readable. I probably should have done that a little earlier on in the video, to be fair. Just coming back to the idea of formatting for the moment, let's apply a slightly more interesting format to our chart. Let's say, for example, we wanted to alter the colour of the bar based on its height. Applying conditional formatting like this is fairly straightforward once you've found where the option actually is. So let's start by selecting the chart, and then we can head to the Format pane and look for the Data Colours card. If we expand that, currently all we can do is choose a different specific colour for each field that is in the values area of the chart. So for example, I could make all the columns in the average Oscar wins red rather than this dark green colour. That's not particularly helpful, and in order to get to the particular options I want, what I'm going to need to do first is remove the second data series. So I need to remove the average Oscar wins, or the average of Oscar nominations. One of the two must go. So back into the fields well, if I click back there first, and then let's just delete average of Oscar wins. Now I can head back to the formatting panel, and if I go to the data colors category again, currently you can see I can choose a specific color for all of the columns. I can also choose to enable the show all option. If I enable that by switching it to on, I can choose a different color for each individual genre. But what I really want is a tiny little hidden away option. If I disable the show all option, and if I get my mouse to a certain position within the card, you might notice this tiny little set of 3 vertical dots appears. Now that's where I want to click. I don't really agree with the design language there. It's not particularly obvious what you can do from that. But if I've got that option available, I can click on those 3 vertical dots, and there's my option for conditional formatting. Good luck finding that without somebody pointing it out to you. Anyway, now that we've found it, we can select that option, and we will end up with a dialog box which allows us to apply conditional formats in a variety of different ways. The default style of conditional format is called color scale, which uses a continuous color gradient to color in the bars based on the continuous range of values in the average Oscar nominations field. If we wanted to be a little more precise, we could use a set of color rules. If I selected the rules option, I can then provide specific conditions under which bars should be colored in a particular color. I'm actually going to go back to the color scale. The field value, by the way, is if you have something in your data set which indicates what color to make the bars. We don't have that in this particular data model. So I'm going to go back to color scale, and I'm going to base the color scale on the average Oscar nominations. So I can select the Oscar nominations field. It gives me a sum by default. I'll switch that to an average. I can then set the color of the lowest value and the color of the highest value. I'm not particularly fond of this sort of murky shading in the middle, so I can click the diverging box to provide a middle value, which makes the scale a little more interesting, fading from red to yellow to green. Having done that, if I simply click OK, I'll find that my bars are coloured in according to their height, where the taller bars are greener and the lower bars are red. If you subsequently wanted to modify your conditional format, it's much easier to find the option now. In the Data Colors category, you've got a big FX button to click on, and clicking there will launch that same dialog box we've just seen. You can apply conditional formats to a variety of visuals. So for instance, if I selected my table, if I have a quick look back in the field well, I can actually apply a conditional format here by right-clicking on one of the columns and then choosing conditional format. So for example, I could format the background colour of the title based on the Oscar wins. So let's just quickly do that. I can choose conditional format, background colour, and then I can go for a colour scale rather than based on a count of title. I could go for the Oscar wins. I'll use the sum, but it will sum across a single row of data, so it will effectively give me the value of Oscar wins. And then I can go for one of these diverging scales again, so I get 3 colours in intermediate stage. If I click OK, then I can see that the greener the colour, the more wins the film has. I'm not hugely fond of that particular colour scheme for my tables, so if I wanted to remove a conditional format, I can right-click on the title field in the field well again, and then I can choose remove conditional formatting. I can just go for the background colour that I've added, or if I've also added a font colour, I can select all to get rid of all the conditional formats from that field. I'd like to spend a little bit of time modifying the gauge at this point. We haven't really paid it much attention up to this stage. You've seen probably already that when we select, for example, a different genre in the chart, the value of the gauge changes. And again, if I select adventure, the value shown on the gauge changes again. But what isn't changing is the position of the bar that indicates the value. It's always sitting exactly halfway between the start and the end of the gauge. And that's because when we select different categories, not only does the average value change, the thing that we've put into the value area, the average Oscar wins, but the upper part of the gauge changes, the maximum value changes as well, to be essentially twice the size of the average. So what we'd really like to do is alter the maximum value of the gauge so that it shows the max value of Oscar wins for that particular category that we've selected. Making this work is fairly straightforward. If I select the gauge, I can then look in the field well to find the maximum value area, and then I can add in the Oscar wins field to the maximum value. That gives me a sum of Oscar wins, so it's set the number to 683 at this point. In fact, let me just change the formatting so you can actually read this. Let's look for the text properties in there and find the data labels, and let's just bump up the font size so you can read what that value is. There we go, so that's a bit easier to see. Right, back to the field well. So I don't want the sum of Oscar wins here. What I want to see is the maximum Oscar wins. So in the field well, I can click on the drop-down arrow and then choose maximum. So the maximum value of Oscar wins for all films, as we can see, if we scroll up to the top of the table, as it's sorted in descending order, is 11. That's the highest total Oscar wins. If I click on the action genre now, we'll see that for action films, the max value is 6 and the average is 0.45. So you can see that now the indicator, the bar, is changing as we select different categories. And that's affected by the slices as well. If I select the 12 genre, and if I select the 12A, etc., this is affecting all of the average and the position of the bar and the max value of the gauge as well. One type of visual we haven't dealt with yet is a map, and there are several different types of map visuals available in Power BI. You can see these in the visuals panel. There's a basic map just called a map. There's something called a filled map as well, and slightly more sophisticated, there's an ArcGIS map, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this intro video, so we're going to ignore that one just for the time being. What I'd like to do is create a new page which we can use to demonstrate maps. Let's start by renaming page 1 as, let's call this one basic visuals, as I guess it's just tables and charts and gauges. And then let's add in a new page. We could choose to duplicate the existing page and then just delete the bits we didn't want. Actually, that might be a good idea. If you wanted to create a brand new blank page, you can just click the new page button here. If I wanted to delete a page, I can click the cross next to its tab and then choose that I do want to delete it. And then this time I'm going to right click on my basic visuals page and choose to duplicate it. I can then double click to rename it. Let's call this one maps. And then we can go about deleting the individual items we don't want to see. So I want to keep all of my slicers. I want to keep my simple line to separate the top half from the bottom half, but I'll just move that up a little bit in this report or in this page. Then I can individually select the other items. I can't click and drag to select multiple items as you might be familiar with doing in other Microsoft products, but I can hold down the Control key as I select other items and then press the Delete key to delete all of them. Let's just change the text in the line controls so that the title isn't just basic visuals. Let's change the title here so that it's called maps. And then we can have a quick look at building some basic map shapes in our report. The easiest way to get started with a map is to click into a blank part of the report page and then just add a column which contains some kind of geographic data. So if you remember from earlier on, we have our country field and we categorize that as country/region. If I simply check that box, I'll end up with a map being created using the basic map visual. And it uses Bing Maps to kind of connect the names of the countries or regions or towns or cities or whatever's in that column to areas in the map. Let's just resize this so it's a little easier to see what's going on. I'll make this about half the width of the page so I can have space for another map in a moment. And then let's just increase the height of it as well to make it a bit bigger. And you can hopefully see there that we're getting a separate dot for each country of the world which is contained in the country column. If I hover the mouse over these individual dots, we can hopefully see that the geography is working correctly. So, yep, looks like I've got the correct countries shown. All I need to do now is start adding in some other fields to change the way these circles or these bubbles appear. So let's start by adding in the runtime minutes. I can tick the box or I can drag it into the size box of the field well. But if I tick runtime minutes, I'll now see that the size of the bubble changes based on the average runtime. So if you remember, we changed the default aggregation of runtime minutes to be average rather than sum. If I wanted to, I can change that, of course, back to sum, but that just means that North America dominates everything. It's Hollywood for you. But if I change that back to an average runtime minutes, that makes things a little more interesting. I can add a field to the legend category as well. So let's use our success column. We had winners and losers earlier on. Let's drag success into the legend box. And we'll now see that each circle gets two halves, a winner and a loser half. So the loser is currently green and the winner is this sort of dark grey black colour. Let's change that around. If I go back to the format pane and look for the data colours category, I can change loser so that that's in a, let's go for red for losers and let's go for green for winners. That looks a little nicer. Okay, so we've got a basic map. It responds to filters and other visual interactions, but if I click on a slicer option, for example, if I go for 18 films, you can see that the map kind of pans and zooms itself to show only those countries containing films made with an 18 certificate. I can change that to something else, like a PG, that's a slightly wider range, and so on and so on. So all the same things happen with the filters and slices as you'd expect to happen with other visuals. There are a few specific formatting options available for a map visual, so let's select the map and then have a look back in the Format panel. So we've seen data colors here already. Let's just collapse that section. We've got a bit of control over the relative sizes of the bubbles. If we expand the bubbles card, we can increase the size by dragging the slider bar if we like, so it can go a bit bigger. It's easy to overwhelm the map completely if you drag it too far, but a small increase makes things a little more interesting. So let's go up to 4, say. We can also modify the map controls, so if you don't like the map panning and zooming itself automatically when you filter it, you can switch off the auto zoom feature, and you can also allow the user to zoom in and out by adding zoom buttons. So you'll see this time I've got plus and minus symbols so the user can zoom in and out if they want to. There's also a map styles option. This is more to do with the Bing Maps layer. If I expand map styles, I've got a basic road view at this point. I can change to an aerial sort of satellite style view, or to something a bit more subtle like a light view. That makes things a little more readable or a little clearer in terms of reading the data. And yeah, that's pretty much it for basic bubble maps. Okay, now let's have a look at what we can do with a basic filled map. I'm just going to start by changing the width of my bubble map. I'll just change it so I don't get that horrible grey bar at the left hand side. And then clicking into a blank part of the page, let's add in a filled map. I'll change the width of this the other way around so I get a bit of a gap between my two maps. And then I can, with that map selected, add in the country field. So this time, rather than having a bubble laid over each individual country, I get a filled in polygon representing each country. And again, I can hover the mouse over the polygon to indicate which country it is in the little tooltip. But there's no obvious thing I can do to modify the colour of those filled in areas, at least not in the field well. To modify this, it's a lot like applying conditional formatting to our chart. If we switch into the Format panel and have a look at the Data Colors area, once again you're looking for this tiny little innocuous little set of 3 vertical dots. If we can click on that little set of dots and then choose conditional formatting, we can begin to format the individual coloured in areas based on either a colour scale or a set of rules or a field value. Let's go for colour scale again, and this time we're going to go for the runtime minutes as we've used in the previous map. Again, because we set the default summarization to average, it selects that for us automatically. I can go for a diverging colour scale, so I get this nice middle colour rather than the murky shade in between, and then I can click OK. And now we can see that we get darker colours for shorter films and greener colours for longer films. It's not particularly useful that we can't see what the average runtime is by hovering the mouse over various items in the map. So what we could do is modify the tooltip fields that are displayed. We can do that back in the field well. If we switch back to the field well, we could add in the runtime minutes field to the tooltips box. And then we can see when we hover the mouse over a country, it shows us the runtime minutes as well. It'd be nice if it indicated that that was the average runtime rather than just runtime minutes, but just as we did earlier on, you can modify the name of a field in a particular visual by double-clicking it in the field well and then just typing a new name. I'll call this one AVG runtime. So hovering the mouse over a country now will show a slightly more useful label next to that value. Okay, so I think I've gone about as far as I'd like to go with basic visuals for this simple intro video. Of course, there are many more visual types available that we haven't even mentioned yet, and many more formatting options available for the visuals we have, and plenty of features of Power BI that we haven't even touched on yet. But we need to save something for later videos in the series. This was, after all, just meant to show you the basic overall workflow to get from a basic empty report into one populated full of interesting visuals. So at this stage, all I'd like to do is save my report. I can do that by clicking the Save button up on the toolbar, and I'll stick this in a local location on my computer, on my desktop. And I'm going to call this one, let's call it Marvelous. Let's call it Marvelous Movie Report. It's pretty marvelous, I think, particularly if this is your first Power BI report. It'll be saved with a PBIX extension, Power BI file. So if I click Save, and then I can just have a quick little look back on my desktop if I hit Windows and D, and there's my Power BI file saved. Now that you have your report saved, you can easily share it with other people simply by sending them the file. If they have Power BI Desktop, they can open up the file. The data model contains all the data that's required, so they'll be able to do to that report everything that we've been doing in this video so far. You may prefer to share your report by first publishing it to the Power BI service, and then depending on exactly which type of Power BI account you have, provide you with a variety of different options for sharing it with other people. For this simple intro video, I'll show you how to publish it using a free Power BI account. So you might want to first of all have a quick search for Power BI and then follow the link to sign in. You can click this sign in button then and you'll be asked to provide credentials. If you've already signed up for an account, that'll just be the same details you used to sign up. If you haven't already signed up, then you'll need a work or school email account. You can't get away with free email accounts like Hotmail or Gmail or anything like that, sadly. So I've already signed in, actually. I've provided my credentials already. So when I click sign in, I should just be taken to the home page of my free Power BI account. The only thing I've really got available here is a workspace. With a free account, you have a single workspace, and a workspace is really just a container for all the content you want to upload. In a pro account, you'll have multiple workspaces, but here, as I say, for a free account, it's just the single one called My Workspace. If we want to publish our report, then we'll need to switch back to the Power BI desktop application, and it doesn't really matter which page we happen to be looking at, so I'll just quickly switch back to the basic visuals page. Then on the Home tab of the ribbon, I can click the Publish button. As I'm already saying, first of all, beg your pardon, I'll have to choose to save it, even though I've just done that. And then, as long as I'm signed in to the same account that I've signed into in the web browser there, I'll be asked to pick my workspace. For a pro account, as I say, there'll be multiple options here. For a free account, just the one. If I click Select, and then I will get a little progress message telling me that the report is being published, along with a little hint giving me some other ideas I can investigate while that's happening, and then it doesn't take too long. There is my Power BI report published to the Power BI service. Now I can view my report in a couple of different ways. The dialog box gives me a link to immediately open up the report in Power BI, or if I've already opened it in my browser, I can just navigate there, and then if I click on my workspace to see the content contained in it, I can see the reports page, and then there's my Marvelous Movie Report published. I'll also publish the data set separately. Something quite interesting in Power BI, the Power BI service online, is that when you have a data set published, you can generate new reports from it quite easily. So you can do many of the things we've been doing in Power BI Desktop by creating your reports directly in the Power BI service. There's a little create button there where I can create new reports. Anyway, I just want to look at the report that I've already uploaded. So if I go back to the reports page and then click to view my Marvelous Movie Report, and then it'll all load up in the online service. Now at this point there are a few tempting looking options that allow me to share this report. If I just close this little extra message that's appeared to tell me that I've uploaded a dataset, there's a little share button in the top right hand corner. Sadly, this is a little misleading. If I click that, I'll be warned that I need a Power BI Pro account to make that work. So I can go for a free trial or upgrade my account by paying a fee, £7.50 a month or $9.99 a month. But I'm going to cancel that for now because there are other options for sharing a report as well. We'll come back to the Pro account and the options available to you there in a later video. For now, all I'd like to do is head to the File menu of my report. And as well as being able to print it, I can also choose to publish this report to the public access version of the Power BI service. So currently the only person able to see this report here is me, because it's been published to my workspace in my account. If I choose to publish it to the web, this will now upload it to a public version of the Power BI service. I can get an embed code then to link to it or embed it in a different website. So I can do that. I'll get little warnings that this data will all be public, so anybody online can view this. Please don't do this with sensitive data that's part of your organization if you're following along with this video. The movie data is absolutely safe and sound to publish publicly. So let's click the publish button, and there's my couple of little links. I'm just going to copy this onto the clipboard first of all. Let's right click and copy that. And then I can close down that little window there. If I want to embed it in a website as well, of course, there's my little embed code. Let's close down that little page there. And then I can create a new tab in Chrome, paste in my URL, and then hit enter to follow it to find my publicly accessible version of this report. So anybody online now can view this report, and if you've published your own copy of this, anybody else can see that too, providing I guess they can guess this very easy to guess URL, or if you share it with them. It's worthwhile checking that all your filters and slices work as you'd expect. You can navigate between different pages in a slightly different way, so you can see your maps there as well, and everything should just work as you'd expect based on the design of your report. Okay, well I think that's it for this particular video. Sorry it's been quite a long one, but there's quite a lot to Power BI as you can tell. Now obviously we've skipped over the details of certain steps and we've just omitted some parts of the product entirely, but that gives us lots of opportunity to investigate those in detail in later parts of the series. So hopefully you'll join us for some of the later videos, and hopefully you feel that if nothing else, you've got an idea for a feel of the basic workflow involved in going from a blank report to a fully published version. Thanks for watching, hope you'll join us for the next one. See you next time.